Chapter 7 Prisoners of the Ape Men.
I went back to our camp and tried to get some rest. It was horrible to try and sleep here, but it was safer than the jungle. The thought that I could die in this place made me very unhappy. The light from Zambo's fire was the only hope of escape from this dangerous world. The next morning, Sir John woke me up.
"Quick, quick, young man," he said.
"What? What is it?" I cried.
"Don't stop to think or talk. Just get the rifles and some food,"
he responded. In a moment we had everything and began running away. Finally, we found a place to hide and stopped to rest. I told him quickly about my adventures the night before. "But what happened to you?" I asked him.
"Well," he began, "early yesterday morning, hundreds of apes started jumping down from the trees above us. They captured us all and took us to where they live. They tied Summerlee and me up. But strangely enough, Challenger looked a lot like the king of the ape men. They gave him special treatment. He stayed with the king and ate fruit. You see, this plateau is divided between the ape men and the Indians. The caves you saw with lights belong to the Indians. There's a constant war between the two groups. In fact, yesterday, the ape men brought back 12 prisoners. They pulled the arms off of 2 of them and killed them. It was a horrible thing to see. We also discovered that they have a special ceremony. They take their prisoners to the edge of the cliffs, and then they throw them off. That is what happened to James Clover, Maple White's friend. Yesterday, they pushed 4 of the Indians off the cliffs. Early this morning, I escaped and went to our camp. There I got you and the guns, and here we are."
After we rested and talked, we ran quickly to where the ape men lived. We arrived and hid behind some trees. I saw something that I will never forget. There was an open area of grass near the edge of the cliffs. The small houses of the ape men were in the trees, and they were made of leaves. In this area there were about 100 ape men. In front of them there was a little group of Indians and Professor Summerlee. Then I saw 2 other strange individuals. One of them was Professor Challenger, and the other was the king of the ape men. Both of them were short, with big chests and large heads. They were both covered with hair. The big difference between the two was that the professor's hair was black and the king's hair was red. Then the ape men took one of the Indians and pushed him off the cliffs. They waited for their next victim. This time it was Summerlee. 2 of the ape men caught him by the arms. Challenger turned to the king. He tried to convince him not to kill Summerlee. The king pushed Challenger away, and then, in that moment, Lord John shot him.
"Shoot them! Shoot, young man, shoot!" he cried.
Professor Challenger and I helped Summerlee to run away. Lord John continued to shoot the ape men. We ran and ran. Finally, we arrived at our camp. We thought we were safe, but then we heard the sound of feet. Lord John went outside with his rifle and found the surviving Indians. They were very frightened. One of them, we thought, was their chief. We could not stay in the camp. The ape men knew where it was. We left with the Indians and found another place to hide. That night, before we slept, Professor Challenger came to me.
"Mr. Malone,"
he said very seriously,
"you won't write that I looked like the king of the ape men?"
"Professor, I'll only write the truth," I answered.
"Very good,"
said Professor Challenger, and went to sleep. The next morning, we decided to go to the Indian caves. We left the forest and walked across an open area. When we arrived at the lake, our Indian friends began to shout with joy. A large number of canoes were coming towards us. When they arrived on land, an older Indian came and embraced the young chief. They had spears and bows and arrows. They were there to save their young chief from the ape men. Then the young chief began to talk to his men. He told them that now was the time to attack and defeat the ape men for the last time. They were all together, and they had the help of these strange men with great magic, our rifles. We, too, decided to go with them the next day to fight the ape men. That evening, we made our camp by the lake. We saw many strange creatures in the water with long necks. One of them came out of the water onto the beach.
Plesiosaurus! It's a plesiosaurus!
Cried Summerlee.
My dear Challenger, we're the luckiest zoologists that have ever lived.
Lord John was not interested in the wonderful animals. Again, he noticed the blue colour of the ground near some volcanic holes. The next day, more Indians came. Now there were about 400 or 500 of them. We all went towards the forest to fight our war against the ape men. Before we arrived, the ape men attacked us. In the open, it was easy to defeat them. When we went in the forest, it was more difficult. But with the help of the rifles, in the end, the Indians won. After the battle, Challenger turned to us and said,
"We've seen one of the typical great battles of history. What, my friends, is the victory of one nation over another nation? It's not important. The result is always the same. The most important victories of human history were different. They were the victories of primitive man over tigers, of primitive man over ape men. Now, the future on this plateau belongs to man."
Chapter 8. Back to London.
After the victory, the Indians invited us to stay with them in their caves. Lord John did not think this was a good idea, so we made our camp near their caves. We now had time to observe the animals of the lake and the plateau. There were many fascinating things to see, but we wanted to go back home. The Indians never helped us. It was clear that they wanted us to stay. With the magic of the rifles, they felt safe. Every time we asked them for rope or wood to build a bridge, they just smiled. Finally, the young chief came to us. He gave us a piece of bark. We took it back to our camp and studied it. "It's very important," I said. "He was very serious when he gave it to us."
Maybe it's a joke,
Summerlee suggested.
"It's clearly some kind of writing,"
said Challenger.
It looks like a puzzle,
said Lord John. Then he grabbed the piece of bark.
"I've got it!"
He cried.
"How many marks are there? 18. Well, there are 18 caves above us."
"He pointed to the caves when he gave it to me," I said.
"Well then, it's certain. This is a map of the caves. Here's a cross. What is the cross for? It's next to a cave that is longer than the other ones."
"It's a cave that goes to the other side of the cliff," I cried.
"I believe our young friend has solved the problem,"
Challenger said. We got some torches and went to explore the cave. We didn't light the torches at first. We walked in the dark because we did not want the Indians to see us. After walking a long way, we lit the torches and walked quickly. Then we arrived at a wall of rock. We all became sad. "Maybe this is the wrong cave," I said.
"No, young man,"
Lord John said.
"this is the right cave."
I looked at the mark on the map again, and I cried with joy. "Follow me! Follow me!" I shouted. We ran back in the cave. "Here," I said, "is where we lit the torches. But the cave has 2 arms. We didn't see the right one." We walked back a short distance and found a large black opening. We went quickly down this arm of the cave. After a while, we saw a light. We ran towards it. We were at an opening on the cliff face.
It's the moon!
Cried Lord John. He was right. We looked down from the opening and saw that we were nearer to the ground than we were to the top. It wasn't going to be easy to get down, but with our rope we could do it. We then returned to our camp. The next evening we secretly took our things to the cave. Professor Challenger wanted to bring a large box, but we managed to get it down. We arrived at our old camp. There was Zambo and about 20 Indians. They helped us to get back to Para. I will not describe our voyage back to England. I will only say that the news of our great discoveries reached England before our arrival. We received many telegrams asking us for information, but we decided not to tell the newspapers anything about our discoveries. First, we wanted to give a complete description of our discoveries to the members of the Zoological Institute. About 5,000 people came to the Queen's Hall to hear about our adventures. It was a wonderful evening. When we arrived in the room, the audience cheered for a long time. Then Professor Summerlee began his presentation. He talked about the new insects and plants. He told everyone about the prehistoric animals from the Jurassic period. He described the iguanodon, the pterodactyls, the allosaurus, and the stegosaurus. He also talked about the ape men and the Indians of the plateau. At the end of his talk, a scientist named Professor Illingworth stood up.
This is all very wonderful, certainly,
he said.
But they have no real proof.
The audience began to shout, and Professor Challenger stood up.
Well, sir,
Professor Challenger said,
Summerlee has his collection of plants and insects. Doesn't that convince you?
No, it doesn't.
We have some photographs.
Photographs can be faked,
Professor Illingworth said.
Do you want to see the creatures for yourself?
Professor Challenger asked.
Yes, of course,
Professor Illingworth answered.
And you will accept that as proof?
Certainly,
answered Illingworth. At that moment, Professor Challenger made a signal. Zambo and I came up to the stage. We carried a large, heavy box, which we put down. Professor Challenger took off the cover. He looked into the box and said,
Come out, you pretty thing.
Then a young pterodactyl jumped up onto the edge of the box. Everybody was shocked. Some ladies screamed. Suddenly, the pterodactyl flew up over the heads of the audience. It flew around in large circles.
Shut the windows! Shut the windows!
Professor Challenger shouted. But there was an open window, and the pterodactyl flew out. Now everybody believed us, and the crowd carried us out of the hall on their shoulders. We were heroes. But what about Gladys? Now I really was a hero. Well, when I arrived in England, there was no telegram from her. I was very worried and went directly to her house. When I went inside, she was at the piano. "Gladys!" I cried. "Gladys!" She looked at me with surprise. She was different. "Gladys!" I cried. "What's wrong? You're my Gladys. Gladys Hungerton."
No,
she said.
I'm Gladys Potts. This is my husband.
Life is certainly absurd. I said hello to a short man with red hair.
I told my husband about us.
Gladys continued.
We have no secrets. Anyway, you left me for your adventure, so I don't think you really loved me very much.
I turned to leave, but then I decided to ask Gladys's husband a question. "How did you win her?" I asked. "Did you go to the North Pole? Did you travel with pirates?"
That's a little personal,
he replied. "Well, just one more question then," I continued. "What's your job?"
I work in an office,
he replied. I left Gladys and her new husband. I felt angry, but I also laughed at the absurdity of the situation. I will now describe one more scene before I finish. Yesterday, Professor Summerlee, Professor Challenger and I had dinner at Lord John's house. After dinner, Lord John spoke to us.
Well,
he said,
there's one thing I want to tell you. Do you remember that I noticed the strange blue colour around the volcanic holes? Well, I've seen volcanic holes like that only in South Africa, near the great diamond mines of Kimberley.
Then he opened a little box and took out about 30 stones.
Well, I found these near the hole where we saw the pterodactyls. I didn't tell you about them earlier because I wanted to be certain. Anyway, an expert looked at them. He said they have a price of at least £200,000. Of course, we will divide this money equally. Well, Challenger, what will you do with your 50,000?
I think,
Professor Challenger said,
that I'll build a private museum. That has always been one of my dreams.
And you, Summerlee?
I'll stop teaching and work on all my collections,
he replied.
I'll use my part of the money,
Lord John said,
to prepare another expedition to our plateau. And you, young man, of course, will use your money to get married.
Not now, I said sadly. But if you want me, I'll be happy to come with you. Lord John said nothing, but he offered me his hand.